She sat me at the kitchen counter. That's where I watched my family celebrate my recipe's success, through the steam of simmering pots, behind stacks of dirty plates I wasn't allowed to leave unattended. I created the recipe, every herb, every technique. But when the cameras started rolling and the interviews began, I wasn't part of it, not even close. I smiled, stayed quiet, and after the last bite of my famous apple strudel was consumed by guests who never knew my name, I resolved to reclaim what was rightfully mine with one television appearance. The recipe had been in my family for 6 generations, passed down from mother to daughter in worn notebooks with handwritten notes in the margins. Little adjustments made through decades of Austrian winters, through wars and peace, through heartache and joy. The secret wasn't just in the ingredients, it was in the timing, the temperature, the way the dough had to rest exactly 17 minutes before being stretched paper-thin across a floured tablecloth. My grandmother had taught me when I was just 10 years old, standing on a footstool in her tiny kitchen, my small hands mimicking her weathered ones as we worked the dough together. "Remember, Elsa," she'd whisper, "this is more than food. This is our history, our story, our legacy." I never imagined my own daughter-in-law would steal that legacy right from under my nose. It started innocently enough. Karen asking for cooking lessons after she married my son Thomas. I was delighted at first, eager to pass down traditions to the next generation. She was attentive, taking detailed notes, asking thoughtful questions. "How exactly do you get the apples so perfectly spiced?" she'd ask, watching me measure cinnamon by hand rather than with measuring spoons. "It's all in the feeling," I'd reply, tapping my heart. "You must cook with this, not just with your hands." She nodded earnestly, but I should have seen the calculation behind her eyes, the way she meticulously documented every motion, every instruction. We spent weekends together in my kitchen, flour dusting our aprons as I revealed family techniques passed through generations. I taught her everything, the secret to the flakiest crust, the precise moment to add the walnuts so they wouldn't burn, the special Austrian brandy that gave the filling its distinctive warmth. How was I to know she wasn't learning out of respect for tradition, but collecting information for her own ambitions? 6 months later, Karen's Old World Strudel appeared at the farmer's market downtown. I discovered it by accident on a Saturday morning, strolling through the stalls as I did every weekend. There it was, displayed proudly under a professionally printed banner featuring her smiling face. The pastries looked exactly like mine, down to the pattern of slits on top that my grandmother had taught me. 3 diagonal cuts, then 2 horizontal, creating a pattern that allowed steam to escape while forming our family's traditional design. My heart stuttered in my chest. People were lined up 6 deep, cash in hand, eager to taste what the banner proclaimed as a modern twist on European baking. I approached slowly, disbelief making my steps heavy. Karen's eyes widened when she saw me, but only for a moment before her professional smile reasserted itself. "Mother Elsa," she called out with false brightness. "Have you come to support my new business venture? Isn't it wonderful?" I could barely speak, could barely breathe through the betrayal tightening my chest. "That's my recipe," I finally whispered. "My family's recipe." She laughed, the sound like glass breaking in my ears. "Oh, Elsa, don't be silly. I've made so many changes. It's completely different now." But it wasn't. As I watched her serve a slice to a customer, I could see it was identical. The same golden crust, the same perfectly caramelized apples, even the same dusting of powdered sugar applied in the distinctive circular motion that my mother had taught me. "I spent months perfecting this recipe," she told an admiring customer, loud enough to ensure I heard. "It's been quite a journey. creating something so unique. My hands trembled at my sides, age spots stark against my pale skin. The recipe book, my grandmother's book with its yellowed pages and faded ink, was locked safely in my kitchen drawer at home. But the recipe itself, the knowledge, I had given away freely, trustingly. I stood there silent, watching her bask in praise that should have been for my family's legacy, for my grandmother's skilled hands. I finally turned away, tears burning behind my eyes that I refused to shed in public. I walked home alone, the familiar streets of our small town suddenly feeling foreign. Thomas called that evening, his voice tight with forced cheerfulness. "Mum, did you see Karen's stall today? Isn't it fantastic? She's already been approached by 3 local restaurants wanting to feature her strudel on their menus." I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles whitened. "Thomas, that's my recipe. Your grandmother's recipe. Our family's legacy." The silence on the line stretched for 1 beat. 2. Then my son, my only child whom I had raised alone after his father died when Thomas was just 7, sighed heavily. "Mum, please don't start this. Karen worked really hard to develop her business. She was inspired by your baking, sure, but she's created something of her own now. Can't you just be happy for her? For us? This could be a big break." I felt something crack inside me then, a hairline fracture in the foundation of trust that had always existed between us. "She didn't create anything," I said quietly. "She took what wasn't hers to take." Thomas's voice hardened. "I think you're just having trouble accepting that someone else might be successful with baking. Karen's younger. She understands marketing and social media. She's bringing these old recipes into the 21st century." Old. The word stung like a slap. I was 67, not ancient, not obsolete. I had run my own successful bakery for 20 years before retiring to care for my ailing mother in her final years. I knew about business, about hard work, about dedication to craft. But suddenly, in my son's eyes, I was just an old woman clinging to outdated ways. "The family dinner on Sunday," I said, changing the subject abruptly. "What time should I arrive?" Another pause, longer this time. "About that, Mom. Karen thought it might be nice to have it at our place this time. She's inviting some food bloggers and local restaurant owners. More of a networking event, really." I understood then. I wasn't invited, not really. I would be an embarrassment, a contradiction to the narrative Karen was crafting about her original creations. "I see," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "Then I'll leave you to it." I hung up before he could respond, before my composure could crack. Sunday dinner had been at my house every week since Thomas was born. 36 years of tradition ended with 1 phone call. I sat in my silent kitchen, surrounded by the ghosts of generations of women who had preserved our family's culinary heritage through war, immigration, hardship. They had entrusted that legacy to me, and I had failed them. That night, I couldn't sleep. The betrayal sat heavy on my chest, making it difficult to breathe. I got up at 3 in the morning and went to my kitchen, pulled out the recipe book from its drawer. The leather cover was worn smooth by countless hands, the pages fragile with age and use. I traced my finger over my grandmother's handwriting, the German script flowing elegantly across the page. Next to it, my mother's notations, then my own. 3 generations visible on 1 page, united by flour and butter and apples. And something else too, the original recipe certificate from 1922, when my grandmother had won a baking competition in Vienna. The judge's stamp and signature clear, even after all these years. The official recognition of Elsa Hoffman's apple strudel, named after me, her first granddaughter, before I was even born. I held the certificate carefully, this tangible proof that the recipe belonged to our family, to me. Karen didn't know it existed. No one did, except me. I had kept it safe all these years, preserved between wax paper in the back of the book. Now, as I looked at it under the soft light of my kitchen lamp, a plan began to form. I wouldn't confront Karen directly. I wouldn't create a family rift that would force Thomas to choose sides. No, I would wait for the perfect moment. And when it came, I would reclaim my grandmother's legacy, and mine, with irrefutable proof. 3 months passed in a blur of cancelled family dinners and declining phone calls. Karen's business expanded rapidly, her stolen strudel recipe appearing on more menus across town with each passing week. I watched from a distance as Karen's Old World Bakery opened a small storefront downtown, my heart aching each time I passed the cheerful blue awning. Local newspapers ran features on the innovative young baker bringing European traditions to modern palates. Social media buzzed with praise for her unique family recipe. Family. The word felt like acid on my tongue. I tried speaking to Thomas again, only to be met with increasing frustration. "Mum, you need to let this go," he insisted during one particularly painful phone call. "Karen has worked hard to build this business. Can't you just be proud that the recipe lives on?" I wanted to scream that it wasn't living on. It was being stolen, its history erased and rewritten. But I held my tongue, not wanting to push my son further away. Instead, I watched and waited, the certificate from 1922 safely tucked away in my bedside drawer. Each night, I would take it out, a reminder that I wasn't crazy, that my feelings of betrayal were justified, that someday the truth would come to light. Then came the announcement that changed everything. The Regional Baking Championship would be televised this year with a special category for heritage desserts. The winner would receive $50,000 and a cookbook deal. Karen, riding her wave of local fame, was among the first to sign up. I learned this not from my son or daughter-in-law, but from the community bulletin board at the senior centre where I volunteered twice a week. The flyer featured Karen's smiling face alongside the other contestants, with a quote beneath her photo. "I'm excited to share my family's centuries-old strudel recipe with a wider audience." My breath caught in my throat. The audacity, the sheer disrespect of claiming generations of my family's work as her own. It ignited something in me that had been smouldering for months. This wasn't just about a recipe anymore. This was about honor, about truth, about not allowing my family's legacy to be erased. That evening, I called the number at the bottom of the flyer. "Hello?" I said, when the coordinator answered, my voice stronger than it had been in months. "My name is Elsa Hoffman. I'd like to register for the Heritage Desserts category." The competition was scheduled for the second Saturday in October, just 4 weeks away. I began practicing immediately, though I hardly needed to. My hands knew this recipe by heart, could perform each step with the muscle memory developed over 60 years of baking. Still, I wanted everything to be perfect. I sourced the finest apples from the same orchard my mother had favoured, imported the specific Austrian brandy that gave the filling its distinctive warmth. I practiced stretching the dough until it was perfectly translucent, just as my grandmother had taught me. "Thin enough to read a love letter through," she would say with a wink. All the while, I kept my participation a secret. I didn't tell Thomas or any of my friends. This confrontation needed to happen in public, with witnesses, with cameras rolling. Otherwise, it would be my word against Karen's. and I had already seen how that would play out within my family. The morning of the competition arrived crisp and clear, perfect apple strudel weather. I dressed with care in a blue dress my late husband had always loved, pinned my silver hair neatly, and tucked the certified recipe, the original, not a copy, into my handbag. The community centre was transformed for the occasion, with cooking stations arranged in a horseshoe pattern facing an audience of about 200 people. Television cameras were positioned throughout the room, their operators moving about quietly as contestants set up their ingredients. I spotted Karen immediately, surrounded by a small entourage, including my son. Thomas's eyes widened when he saw me, confusion and alarm crossing his face in quick succession. He broke away from the group and hurried over. "Mum, what are you doing here?" His voice was tense, glancing over his shoulder to where Karen was arranging her ingredients. I smiled calmly. "The same as everyone else, Thomas. I'm competing." His face flushed. "Is this some kind of joke? Some attempt to embarrass Karen? Because if it is—" I cut him off gently but firmly. "No, Thomas. This is about the truth. Nothing more, nothing less." Before he could respond, the organisers were calling for contestants to take their places. I squeezed his hand briefly, then moved to my assigned station, 3 spots away from Karen. When she finally noticed me, her professional smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered, nodding stiffly in my direction. "Welcome to the 17th Annual Regional Baking Championship." The announcer's voice boomed through the room. "Today's special category celebrates heritage desserts, recipes passed down through generations, carrying the rich histories of families and cultures." I could feel Karen's eyes on me as I quietly unpacked my ingredients, arranged them precisely as my grandmother had taught me. The irony of the announcer's words wasn't lost on me. Heritage, generations, family. These weren't just pretty concepts for marketing. They were the very heart of what had been stolen from me. The competition began, and I fell into the familiar rhythm of baking, my hands working confidently despite the pressure. While other contestants consulted written recipes or measured ingredients with scientific precision, I worked from memory and feeling. The moderator stopped at each station, interviewing contestants as they worked. When he reached Karen, she launched into her practiced story. "This recipe has been a journey of discovery for me, adapting traditional techniques for the modern palate." When the moderator reached my station, he seemed surprised by my traditional approach. "You're not using a mixer or any modern equipment?" he asked, microphone extended toward me. I smiled, continuing to work the dough with practiced hands. "This recipe predates such conveniences," I replied. "My grandmother learned it from her mother in Austria, who learned it from her mother. Some things are better preserved than changed." I could see Karen stiffen at her station, her hands faltering mid-task. The moderator, sensing a story, probed further. "So, this is a very old family recipe?" I nodded, feeling the weight of the certificate in the pocket of my apron. 6 generations. It won a competition in Vienna in 1922, when my grandmother named it after me before I was even born. The original certificate is one of my most treasured possessions. A murmur ran through the audience. The cameras, sensing drama, swung in my direction. I hadn't planned to reveal so much so soon, but the words had flowed naturally, truth-seeking light after months in shadow. From the corner of my eye, I could see Thomas in the audience, his face pale with realization. Karen was openly staring now, her own dough forgotten in her hands. The next 2 hours passed in focused work, the familiar motions of creating my family's strudel bringing me a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. When the final timer rang, signaling the end of baking time, I stood back and looked at my creation. It was perfect, golden and flaky, the aroma of cinnamon and apples filling the air around my station. The judges moved from contestant to contestant, sampling each entry, making notes on clipboards. When they reached Karen's station, she had recovered her composure, presenting her strudel with practiced charm. "The secret," she told them confidently, "is in the balance of spices and the careful preparation of the dough." The judges nodded, tasting appreciatively. Then they moved to my station. I stood tall, despite my aching back, pride straightening my spine. "Mrs. Hoffman," the lead judge said, "please tell us about your entry." I gestured to my strudel, steam still escaping from the traditional slits in the top, 3 diagonal, 2 horizontal, forming our family pattern. "This is Elsa Hoffman's apple strudel, created by my grandmother Elsa, for whom I was named. The recipe has remained unchanged for nearly a century." I reached into my apron pocket and withdrew the certificate, protected in its archival sleeve. "This is the original certificate of recognition from the Vienna Baking Exhibition of 1922. The lead judge examined it carefully, her eyebrows rising. "This is remarkable. A documented culinary heritage." She passed the certificate to her colleagues, who murmured appreciatively. Then they tasted my strudel, closing their eyes as the flavors registered. "Extraordinary," the lead judge said. "Absolutely authentic." The cameras moved in closer, capturing the moment. I could feel Karen's glare from across the room, could see Thomas working his way toward the front of the audience, his expression unreadable. The judges conferred for nearly 30 minutes while the audience waited in anticipation. Finally, they returned to the center of the room. "We have reached our decision," the lead judge announced. "But before we reveal the winner, there's a matter that needs addressing." She turned toward Karen and me. "We have 2 remarkably similar entries in this competition. So similar, in fact, that they appear to be the same recipe." A hush fell over the room. The judge continued. "Mrs. Hoffman has provided documented evidence that this recipe has been in her family since at least 1922. She turned to Karen. "Ms. Davis, can you provide any documentation for your claim to this recipe?" The cameras swung to capture Karen's response. Her face flushed, then paled. She glanced desperately at Thomas, who stood frozen at the edge of the crowd. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable. Finally, Karen spoke, her voice barely audible even with the microphone. "I learned the recipe from Elsa. She's my mother-in-law. I made some small adjustments." I felt no triumph in that moment, only a profound sadness. This public unmasking was necessary, but it brought me no joy. The lead judge nodded slowly. "Then the authentic heritage recipe belongs to Mrs. Hoffman." She straightened, addressing the audience and cameras. "The winner of the heritage dessert category and recipient of the $50,000 prize and cookbook contract is Elsa Hoffman." Applause erupted, but I barely heard it. I was watching my son, whose face reflected confusion, embarrassment, and dawning realization. Karen had disappeared backstage. After the ceremony, Thomas approached me cautiously. "Mom," he began, his voice thick. "I didn't know. I really didn't know." I took his hand in mine. "Some truths are hard to see when we're not looking for them," I said gently. We stood together in silence, surrounded by the buzz of the dispersing crowd, the scent of baked apples still hanging in the air. The recipe had been reclaimed, my family's legacy restored. But the real work, rebuilding trust, healing the fractures in our relationship, was just beginning. That would require a different kind of recipe altogether. The applause had barely faded when the real storm hit. I stood in the community centre's parking lot, trophy clutched in one hand, certificate safely tucked away in my purse. The evening air had turned chilly, carrying the first hint of autumn frost. Thomas approached slowly, his footsteps hesitant on the asphalt. His face bore the complicated expression of someone trying to reconcile two contradicting truths. "Mom," he began, voice catching. "Why didn't you just tell me from the beginning? Why go through all this?" He gestured vaguely toward the building where camera crews were still packing equipment. I studied my son's face, the face I had memorized from his first moments in this world, the tiny scar above his eyebrow from falling off his bike at age 8, the laugh lines that matched his father's. I saw confusion there, and hurt, but not understanding. Not yet. "Would you have believed me?" I asked quietly. "Over her?" The silence that followed was answer enough. He looked away, shoulders slumping under the weight of an uncomfortable truth. We both knew that he had chosen her version of reality, had accepted her story without question, while dismissing mine as the jealous complaints of an old woman. The realization settled between us like an uninvited guest, awkward and impossible to ignore. 3 days after the competition, the story broke wide open. "Family recipe scandal, local baker exposed," ran the headline in the town paper. The accompanying article detailed the competition, my victory, and Karen's public admission that she had taken my recipe. Social media erupted with opinions. Half the town condemned Karen as a thief. The other half insisted I was a spiteful mother-in-law who couldn't bear to see a younger woman succeed. Nobody seemed interested in the truth, that this was never about competition or jealousy or age. It was about legacy, about respect, about the generations of women in my family who had preserved and perfected this recipe through world wars and economic depressions and personal tragedies. It was about my grandmother's hands guiding mine as a child, showing me how to stretch dough so thin you could read a newspaper through it. It was about the hours my mother and I spent in the kitchen after my father died, baking our grief into something sweet and sustaining. It was about the stories told over warm slices of strudel, family histories preserved in sugar and cinnamon. None of that made it into the newspaper. Instead, people chose sides, drew battle lines, turned a family wound into public entertainment. Karen's shop closed temporarily, a handwritten sign on the door citing family circumstances as the reason. I hadn't meant to destroy her business, only to reclaim what was rightfully mine. The cookbook deal moved forward quickly, the publisher eager to capitalize on the publicity. They sent a professional photographer to my home to capture images of me baking in my kitchen, my hands demonstrating the techniques passed down through generations. "We want authenticity," the editor explained over the phone. "Real heritage, real stories." I almost laughed at the irony. Suddenly, my age was an asset, my wrinkled hands proof of experience rather than obsolescence. The very things Karen had tried to erase from the narrative were now marketable, desirable, profitable. During the photo shoot, I caught myself searching for Thomas in my peripheral vision, an instinct born from decades of him sitting at my kitchen counter, stealing apple slices when he thought I wasn't looking. But he wasn't there. He hadn't been to my house since the competition. The absence echoed through my kitchen like a physical presence. "Tell us about the women in your family," the cookbook writer prompted during our interview, recorder positioned carefully beside a plate of freshly baked strudel. "The ones who passed this recipe down to you." I closed my eyes briefly, seeing them all. My great-grandmother, whom I knew only from photographs, her stern face and capable hands. My grandmother with her animated stories and unlimited patience. My mother, who taught me that precision is an expression of love. I spoke about them for hours, my voice growing hoarse with emotion and use. The writer captured it all, nodding encouragingly, occasionally wiping away tears of her own. I told her about coming to America as a young bride, how I'd packed my grandmother's recipe book carefully between layers of clothing, how it was the first thing I unpacked in our tiny first apartment. I explained how I'd adapted to American ingredients while maintaining the essence of the original recipe, how I'd taught neighborhood women to make strudel during the energy crisis when buying baked goods became a luxury. By the time we finished, darkness had fallen outside my kitchen window, and the writer's notebook was filled with my family's history. "This is gold," she said, closing her notebook reverently. "Absolute gold." A week passed, then two. The media attention began to fade, replaced by newer scandals, fresher controversies. I continued my routine, volunteering at the senior center, tending my garden, testing recipes for the cookbook. But the hollow space where family dinners should have been remained unfilled. I hadn't heard from Thomas since our awkward conversation in the parking lot. Karen had disappeared entirely from public view. My victory felt increasingly Pyrrhic, the prize money sitting untouched in my bank account. What good was reclaiming my recipe if I'd lost my family in the process? The question haunted me as I moved through quiet days and sleepless nights. Then, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Karen standing on my porch, soaked from the rain, her usual perfect appearance disheveled. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying or lack of sleep, perhaps both. "May I come in?" she asked, voice barely audible above the patter of raindrops. I stepped aside wordlessly, leading her into the kitchen where so many important conversations in my life had taken place. She sat at my table, hands clasped tightly together, water dripping from her hair onto my polished wood. I put a kettle on without asking, the instinct to provide warmth and comfort overriding my lingering resentment. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the rain against the windows and the building rumble of the kettle. Finally, Karen broke the silence. "I didn't come here to apologize," she said, surprising me with her honesty. "At least, not only for that. I came because I need to understand." I placed a mug of tea in front of her, the steam rising between us like a question. "Understand what?" I asked, taking the seat across from her. She looked up, meeting my eyes directly for perhaps the first time since I'd known her. "Why it matters so much. It's just a recipe. A good one, yes, but—" She trailed off, seeing something in my expression that made her reconsider her words. I took a deep breath, considering how to explain something so fundamental, so intrinsic to who I was. "It's not just a recipe," I began. "It's my history, my identity. When you claimed it as your own creation, you weren't just taking a list of ingredients. You were erasing me, my mother, my grandmother, all of us." Understanding dawned slowly across Karen's face. For the first time, I saw her not as my usurper or my son's wife, but as a young woman who had never known the kind of connection to the past that I took for granted. "I grew up in foster care," she said abruptly. "Did Thomas tell you that?" I shook my head. 6 different homes before I aged out of the system. No family recipes, no traditions, no sense of belonging anywhere. She stared into her tea, avoiding my gaze. "When you taught me to make strudel, it was the first time I felt connected to something historical, something bigger than myself." Her hands trembled slightly around the mug. I wanted it to be mine. I wanted that history, that legacy. The confession hung in the air between us, Not an excuse, but an explanation. I felt something shift inside me, a loosening of the rigid anger I'd been carrying. "You have no idea what it's like," she continued, "to have no roots, no family stories, no one who remembers you as a child." But I did know. Not personally, but through the stories my grandmother had told about fleeing Austria during the war, about starting over in a new country where no one knew her name or her history. "The recipe could have been yours too," I said finally. "Properly. Honestly. That's how family traditions work. They're not stolen, they're given, shared, passed down." Karen looked up, surprise evident in her reddened eyes. "What do you mean, could have been?" I rose from the table and walked to the cabinet where I kept my grandmother's recipe book. I returned with it and placed it gently on the table between us. "This belongs to the women in my family. My grandmother wrote your name in it the day you married Thomas, along with a note that said, 'Welcome, daughter.'" I opened to the inside cover, where generations of women's names were recorded in different handwritings, Karen's added in my grandmother's shaky script before she passed away. Karen stared at it, one finger hovering over her name without quite touching it. "I didn't know," she whispered. I thought you saw me as an outsider." I closed the book carefully, protecting its fragile pages. "You made yourself an outsider when you chose to steal rather than inherit," I said, not unkindly. "But that doesn't mean you can't still choose differently." We talked for hours that afternoon, the rain tapering off and starting again, the light shifting from grey to gold as the sun emerged briefly before setting. Karen told me about growing up without traditions, about the emptiness of having no family history to draw from. I told her about my grandmother's journey from Austria, about the recipes that survived when photographs and heirlooms didn't. Somewhere in those hours, the anger between us didn't exactly dissolve, but transformed into something more complex and potentially more healing. "I can't reopen the shop," she said eventually. "Not with your recipe. Not after everything." I nodded, understanding the impossibility of continuing as though nothing had happened. "What will you do?" I asked. She looked down at her hands, baker's hands with small burns and calluses similar to my own. "I don't know. Start over, I guess. Find something that's actually mine to share." The vulnerability in her voice reminded me of Thomas as a child, lost and looking for direction. Before I could respond, before I could offer what was forming as an idea in my mind, the front door opened. Thomas stood in the hallway, keys in hand, staring at us both with undisguised shock. "Mom? Karen? What's going on here?" Thomas stood frozen in the doorway, his expression shifting rapidly between confusion and alarm. Rain dripped from his coat onto the hardwood floor, forming small puddles that reflected the kitchen light. "I've been looking everywhere for you," he said to Karen before turning to me. "Both of you, actually." I gestured to the chair beside me. "Sit down, son. We're just talking." He moved cautiously, as if entering territory that might still contain hidden landmines. Karen wiped her eyes quickly, attempting to compose herself. The three of us sat in awkward triangle, decades of love and recent betrayal crowding around us like uninvited guests. Thomas spoke first, his voice tight with emotion. "I thought I'd find you arguing, or worse." A faint smile touched my lips. "We've moved past that stage. We're onto something more productive." Karen nodded in agreement, her hands still wrapped around the now cold mug of tea. Thomas looked between us, clearly struggling to understand the apparent truce. "So, you've worked things out? Just like that?" The disbelief in his voice was palpable. Nothing about this has been just like that, I replied, reaching for my grandmother's recipe book. We've been talking about family, about legacy, about belonging. I opened the book to the inscription page, where generations of names formed a living family tree. Your grandmother added Karen's name here when you got married, I explained to Thomas, before any of this happened. That's what family does. We make room for new members. We share our history. We pass things down. Thomas stared at the page, recognition dawning in his eyes. He had seen this book throughout his childhood, had watched me refer to it countless times, but had never paid attention to the names inscribed inside. I didn't know, he whispered, echoing Karen's earlier words. I never realized. His voice trailed off as he traced the names with his finger, generations of women connected by ink and paper and shared knowledge. I watched my son's face as he processed what this meant. Not just about the recipe, but about his place in a larger story that stretched backward through time and forward into a future yet unwritten. I've been thinking, I said carefully, addressing them both, about what happens next. The cookbook deal includes recipes beyond just the strudel. I was planning to include other family recipes as well, the Christmas bread, the dumplings, the torts. I paused, gathering courage for what I wanted to propose. It would be better, I think, if there were 2 names on the cover, 2 generations of bakers. Karen's head snapped up, disbelief written across her features. You want me to co-author the cookbook? After everything? I met her gaze steadily. Not despite everything, because of everything. You have talent, Karen. Real talent. What you lack is history. I have plenty of that to share. Thomas watched this exchange with widening eyes, hope cautiously flickering across his face. Mum, are you sure? He asked, protective instinct evident in his tone. I nodded, more certain with each passing moment. The recipes were always meant to be passed down, not hoarded. That's how they stay alive. I turned to Karen. But this time, we do it right, with proper acknowledgement of where they came from, with respect for the women who created and preserved them. Karen's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back resolutely. I don't deserve this second chance, she said quietly. No one would blame you for shutting me out completely. I thought about resentment, about the bitter taste it had left in my mouth these past months, about how easily it could become a poison that destroyed everything it touched. Deserving has nothing to do with it, I replied. Family is more complicated than that. Thomas reached across the table, taking both our hands in his. For a moment, we formed an unbroken circle, 3 generations connected despite everything that had tried to pull us apart. So what now? He asked. What exactly are you proposing? I took a deep breath, the plan forming more clearly as I spoke it aloud. We combine forces. My history, Karen's modern approach. The cookbook becomes a bridge between generations. And maybe, I added, the idea taking shape as I spoke, we think about a new venture. Not Karen's old-world bakery, but something that acknowledges both of us. Something honest about where these recipes come from and where they're going. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. The publisher was thrilled with the new direction, seeing even greater marketing potential in our reconciliation story. From recipe theft to family legacy, a culinary redemption became the cookbook's subtitle. Karen's suggestion that acknowledged the truth without flinching from it. We worked side by side in my kitchen, photographing recipes, testing variations, recording stories. I taught her the family techniques my grandmother had taught me. How to tell when dough has been kneaded enough by the sound it makes under your hands. how to adjust spices based on the sweetness of the fruit, how to feel when a cake is done without relying on a timer. She brought her own insights, modern adaptations for common allergies, presentation techniques she'd learned from culinary blogs, flavor combinations that appealed to younger palates. Our differences, which had once driven us apart, now created something stronger and more versatile than either of us could have managed alone. The photographer captured it all, our 4 hands working together on the same dough, the contrast of my wrinkled skin against her smooth forearms, the identical expressions of concentration as we bent over a delicate pastry decoration. Thomas watched our collaboration with something like wonder, occasionally joining us to taste test or offer encouragement. One evening, as the 3 of us sat around my kitchen table enjoying slices of experimental strudel variations, he cleared his throat nervously. "I've been thinking about what you said, Mom, about family legacies." Karen and I looked up from our note-taking, sensing something important in his tone. He reached for Karen's hand before continuing. "We found out last week, but with everything going on, well, it didn't seem like the right time to share the news." My heart skipped a beat, intuition running ahead of his words. "We're going to have a baby," he said finally. "You're going to be a grandmother." The pencil slipped from my fingers, rolling across the table unnoticed. A grandchild. Another generation to carry forward our stories, our traditions, our recipes. Karen's free hand moved unconsciously to her still flat stomach, a protective gesture as old as motherhood itself. In that moment, our reconciliation transformed from a business arrangement to something far more profound. This wasn't just about a cookbook anymore. It was about the child who would someday stand on a footstool in this very kitchen, learning to stretch dough paper thin, hearing stories about great-great-grandmothers they would never meet, but whose legacy lived on in their hands. Hoffman and Family Bakery opened 6 months later in a small storefront 2 blocks from where Karen's original shop had been. The sign featured 2 intertwined rolling pins, one old-fashioned wooden one modern silicone. My idea, symbolizing the blending of traditions. The cookbook had launched to unexpected success, the story of our conflict and reconciliation resonating with readers far beyond our small town. Inside the shop, photographs lined the walls, not just of baked goods, but of the women in my family. My grandmother in her kitchen in Austria, flour dusting her apron. My mother teaching me to crimp pie edges, me showing Thomas how to separate eggs. And now, Karen learning from me. The 2 of us side by side. The next link in an unbroken chain. The centerpiece was a framed copy of the 1922 certificate, alongside a handwritten recipe card bearing both our names. Beneath it, a small photograph of Karen's ultrasound, the newest baker in our family, still months away from their first breath. Customers sometimes asked about the scandal, curious about the drama that had briefly made local headlines. We developed a simple response. Family recipes, like families themselves, can survive misunderstandings when there's enough love to go around. On opening day, I arrived early to find Karen already there, arranging fresh strudel in the display case. Her pregnancy was showing now, a gentle curve beneath her chef's coat. She straightened when she saw me, brushing flour from her hands. "I was just thinking," she said, gesturing to the trays of baked goods, "about what your grandmother would think of all this." I looked around the shop, at the old recipes presented with new twists, at the blending of tradition and innovation, at the photographs that connected past to present. "She would understand completely," I replied with certainty. She was the one who taught me that recipes aren't meant to be guarded like secrets. They're meant to be shared, like love. Karen nodded, one hand resting on her growing belly. I'm going to teach this little one everything you've taught me, she promised. With proper attribution, of course. We both laughed, the lingering tension between us dissolving a little more each day. The bell above the door jingled as Thomas entered, carrying a bouquet of flowers for each of us. "Ready for the grand opening?" he asked, looking between us with unmistakable pride. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of freshly baked strudel and new beginnings. "More than ready," I replied. "We've been preparing for this for generations." The winter after opening Hoffman and Family Bakery brought an unexpected visitor. I was experimenting with a honey-sweetened strudel when the bell jingled. A tall woman in her 70s entered, shaking snow from her coat. Something about her seemed familiar as she studied our wall of photographs, particularly my grandmother in her Vienna kitchen. "Elsa Hoffman," she said, with a faint Austrian accent. "Named for your grandmother, I believe?" I approached cautiously. "Yes." "Did you know her?" The woman turned, and suddenly I recognized my grandmother's distinctive blue-grey eyes, the same ones I'd inherited. "I'm Elizabeth Bauer, your grandmother's sister's granddaughter, your second cousin." My hands flew to my mouth in surprise. I knew the name. My grandmother had mentioned her sister's family who remained in Europe when she emigrated. Connections had faded after my grandmother died, addresses lost to time and distance. "How did you find me?" I finally asked. "The cookbook," Elizabeth smiled. "It was featured in a Viennese baking magazine. Imagine my surprise seeing our family strudel recipe." She gestured to the framed certificate. "That competition was famous in my family too." We moved to a corner table with coffee and fresh strudel. Elizabeth took a bite, closing her eyes. "It's different, but the essence is exactly the same." Over the next hour, we filled in decades of shared history. Elizabeth's family had weathered wars and political changes while preserving our recipes. They'd opened a cafe in Vienna in the 1950s, now run by her daughter. "We have the same certificate," she said, showing me her copy, identical except for slight variations in the judge's handwriting. All these years, I thought our culinary legacy lived only through me, but it had been thriving an ocean away, tended by hands related to mine by blood and flour. "We need to add your photograph to our wall," I said, gesturing to our family gallery. The branches reconnected. When Karen arrived, her pregnancy now in its 7th month, she joined our conversation eagerly. "Tell me about your Christmas bread," she asked Elizabeth. "We've been trying to perfect ours for the cookbook sequel." Elizabeth laughed. "You remind me of my daughter, always looking for improvements." She turned to me. "It's good to have that energy. Tradition needs both keepers and creators." I watched these women from different generations and continents bond instantly over shared passion. Thomas arrived later, immediately noting the family resemblance in Elizabeth. After explanations, he joined our reunion. "We have to update the cookbook," he said practically. "Add Elizabeth's branch of the family tree," Karen enthusiastically agreed. "And we should visit Vienna to compare techniques." Elizabeth beamed. "My daughter would be overjoyed. We have an apartment above the cafe where family always stays." The word family resonated differently now, expanded beyond the tight circle I had known. Elizabeth stayed 2 weeks, sharing dozens of recipe variations and unknown stories about my grandmother. Her cooking classes at the bakery had customers lining up around the block. Most importantly, she bridged the final gaps between Karen and me. "You two complete each other as bakers," she observed. "One honors the past, one embraces the future. Together, you create something timeless." What had begun as theft had transformed into genuine partnership, stronger for having weathered conflict. When Elizabeth departed, promising return visits and internship exchanges with her cafe, she left behind a sense of wholeness, a circle completed. Spring arrived with gentle rain and the scent of cherry blossoms. Karen's due date approached, bringing both excitement and anxiety. Our cookbook entered its third printing, with international translations now available. The small bakery had become a destination, drawing visitors eager to taste the infamous strudel and meet the women behind the reconciliation story that had captured so many imaginations. On a beautiful April morning, as I mixed dough, Karen appeared earlier than scheduled. "It's time," she said simply. I abandoned the dough without hesitation, grateful for our trained apprentices who could take over. Thomas met us at the hospital, his face a mixture of terror and joy. 14 hours later, Elisa Marie Hoffman entered the world, named for my grandmother and Karen's favourite foster mother. I held the tiny bundle, looking down at features that somehow combined Thomas's chin, Karen's nose, and unmistakably my grandmother's eyes. "Hello, little baker," I murmured. "We've been waiting for you." Karen watched from the hospital bed, exhausted but radiant. "She'll learn all our recipes," she promised. "Yours first, the originals. Then maybe someday she'll create her own." Through all the turmoil, betrayal, and reconciliation, this was what mattered. This continuation, this passing of the torch, this new life who would someday stand in our kitchen learning recipes that had travelled across oceans and generations. The day we brought Elisa home, a package arrived from Vienna containing a tiny chef's apron embroidered with Hoffman and Family Bakery, Next Generation. As I rocked my granddaughter while Karen rested, I told her the story of the strudel. Not the painful recent chapter, but the older, deeper story. How her great-great-grandmother had created it in a time of hardship, how it had sustained our family through wars and migrations, how it connected us to people we had never met, but with whom we shared history and blood, and a love of creating nourishment from simple ingredients. "The secret ingredient," I whispered, "isn't in the recipe at all. It's in the hands that make it. It's in the stories we tell while we bake. It's in the love that passes from one generation to the next." 1 year after the competition that had exposed Karen's deception, we held a celebration. Elizabeth and her daughter flew from Vienna, bringing traditional decorations and a special anniversary strudel combining elements from both family variations. For the official photograph, Karen and I stood side by side behind the counter, each with one hand on a rolling pin, Elizabeth beside us representing the Austrian branch. Before us sat 3 versions of the strudel, my grandmother's original, Karen's modern adaptation, and Elizabeth's Viennese variation. 3 expressions of the same heritage, each valuable, each authentic. After the celebration, as we sat with sleeping Elisa in her carrier, Karen shared her thoughts. "What if she doesn't want to be a baker?" I asked. "What if she wants to be an astronaut or novelist?" Karen smiled. "Then the recipes will still be hers, to use or not, to change or preserve, to pass down or keep private. That's her birthright." Elizabeth nodded. "That's how traditions survive, not by forcing them on the next generation, but by offering them as gifts to be accepted freely." Thomas raised his coffee cup. "To family recipes, the ones written down and the ones still being created." The next morning, I arrived before dawn, as always. I tied on my grandmother's old apron, worn soft with years of use, and began the day's first batch of strudel dough, my hands knowing the rhythm without thought. The shop wouldn't open for hours, but soon Karen would arrive, Then our apprentices, bringing conversation and innovations. For now, I worked in peaceful solitude, feeling the presence of women who had stood in kitchens before me. Through the window, I could see spring's first blooms in our herb garden. As the dough came together under my hands, I reflected on legacy. It wasn't about ownership or control. It wasn't about perfect preservation. It was about growth, about adaptation, about allowing what was valuable to evolve without losing its essence. We are all recipes in progress, combinations of what we've inherited and what we've created, constantly being adjusted through experience and relationship. The true secret ingredient isn't something you can measure or list on a recipe card. It's the willingness to share, to teach, to learn, to forgive, to begin again. It's the understanding that we are all connected through food, through family, through the simple, profound act of breaking bread together.